So welcome to the Santa Cruz Queer History webinar series, co-sponsored by the Diversity Center of Santa Cruz County and the Museum of Art and History. We're excited that all of you are here. Once again, if you haven't done so already, please mute your device unless you're one of the guests. Any questions that you have, please use the chat room. There'll be a few, there'll be time for questions at the end, but for now, type them into the chat room and then I'll be the one to ask those questions so that we can make sure that our webinar is efficient. If you want to hang out afterwards in the space, you're welcome to do so. We won't record that part, then we can just talk to whoever. After the webinar, if you do have feedback, we'd appreciate your feedback on my website, www.robdarrow.us. And the Mon, the Diversity Center, will all post the recording of this. And again, if you're just listening in and you want to email me with thoughts or ideas, feel free to do so. Again, it's Rob Darrow. My email, robdarrow74@gmail.com. So as we start thinking about Santa Cruz queer history, we developed these webinars because we realized as the pandemic has moved forward that most of us would not get a chance to see the exhibit as it develops. We hope that when the pandemic is over, that you'll all come to Santa Cruz and visit the MA here to see the exhibit. The exhibit is going to open online first on April 24th. Know that we're learning as we go here, and we appreciate your feedback, as I mentioned before. Our next webinars will be on Tuesday and Thursday, beginning at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We are experimenting a little bit with the times and that sort of thing. So I shared those ground rules. Once again, we're hoping that people of all ages can watch this webinar and learn more about Santa Cruz queer history, but also the overall LGBTQ history as well. So just to share a little bit about the Santa Cruz County queer history, it parallels the national LGBTQ rights movement. Santa Cruz County people have impacted the national LGBTQ rights movement and vice versa. The fact that we have UC Santa Cruz and Cabrillo College that developed in the 60s helped impact that as well. And overall as a community, Santa Cruz County has always been a pretty inclusive community in lots of ways, which is what has caused a lot of the history to develop in Santa Cruz. Now, just to little broaden the national LGBTQ history perspective here, in the 1950s, there was a thing called the Lavender Scare. LGBTQ people were removed from government and military. In the 50s and 60s, LGBTQ people started to organize. We had the Mattachine Society that developed in Los Angeles, and then the Daughters of Bilitis that started in San Francisco. 1966 was the Compton's Cafeteria riots in San Francisco, and then in 1969 were the Stonewall riots in New York. But in Santa Cruz, not too long afterwards, we had our first group that organized here in 1974, and that's called LAGMU, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And then for another webinar, we'll talk about the first Santa Cruz Pride event that was in 1975. But I put all that in that context, and if you don't know some of this history, then go look it up, or you can check out my website where a lot of that history is, because it's pretty exciting and interesting. So our topic today is how LAGMU sparked the Santa Cruz County LGBTQ rights movement in 1974. So LAGMU is Lesbian and Gay Men's Union, developed as a club at Cabrillo College. And just to set the context a little bit, if you lived in 1974, you might look like one of these people in this photo here. And the people who are speaking, some of them are in that photo, and they could talk about that in a little bit. The first LAGMU newsletter is on your screen at this point. You can see that the purpose of the newsletter of LAGMU is to provide information and a sense of continuity to the membership of the Lesbian and Gay Men's Union. And hopefully future issues can contain more personal notices, and you can submit future material to Larry Friedman, who's on this webinar.
Yay.
You can call him at that number. I don't know if that's still your number, Larry.
No, it's not.
Anyway, that was back in 1975. So with that, I'm going to click back so you can see everybody else on the screen and stop my sharing. And then I'm going to move on to the different questions and the guests who are here. In the order that we're going to go in is, Shawn, I'm going to have you speak first, then Jude, then David, then Larry, then Arthur. Dave Kirk, are you on here? Dave Kirk didn't make it on. And then Dan, and then did I forget anybody? I think I got everybody. So we'll go in that order. So here's the first question, and then as you're speaking, then we'll all hear your voice. So the first question that I want all of you to answer is, what brought you to Santa Cruz, and how did you first get connected with LAGMU? And again, we'll start with Shawn on that question.
Well, I grew up close to Santa Cruz in Salinas, and I just always liked Santa Cruz. I'd go over there and stuff. So after I finished high school, then I took a trip to Europe and North Africa for about 11 months. I came back to Santa Cruz. And I don't remember how I met Judith. I don't remember how we met, but we just felt like there wasn't enough stuff going on for the community for gay men and lesbians. And we just wanted to get an organization going that could hopefully serve some political needs, but a lot of social needs too. So not everyone was 21, and there were a lot of younger people in the high schools and stuff that wanted to be involved. So that's kind of how I got involved.
Great. Jude?
Well, I graduated from Santa Cruz High School in 1967, so I was already there. I was kind of different all through school. I wasn't exactly sure what was going on, but I hooked up with Ida Murray, who was a teacher out at Cabrillo College, and she gave us the room. I don't remember what her title was even, but she gave us a place to gather on the Cabrillo College campus, and it all just went from there. It was awesome.
Great. David?
I came to Santa Cruz in 1973, and I was starting to come out in the summer of 74, and I met Dan, and I met Larry, and I met Shawn at a men's group meeting at Dan's house on Capitola Road in the fall of 74, and the rest is history. Now, it was just a very, very heady time. I think a lot of things are coming together. A lot of us were involved in other political action groups in Santa Cruz. It was the Vietnam War, anti-war movement was still going on. And there was a lot of stuff happening with feminism. There were a lot of women's groups, and kind of the perfect crystallization, I would say. And I invited Dan to move in with me, and Shawn moved in to our house on Putter Drive in Monterey Bay Heights, kind of a highfalutin or a middle-class neighborhood. But anyway, I strongly remember Judith and Dan sitting at our dining room table planning LAGMU. I remember I have that strong image in my mind. So houses were such a hotbed of activity. You know, a lot of meetings took place at our house and other houses. And it seemed like Ida Murray, and there was another person at Cabrillo, I can't think of her name right now, who was so supportive. And so it really became kind of a community spot. And, you know, there are lots of social things going on there too, besides actually planning political kinds of activities. There were potlucks and so on. But I think it was a time where we all felt like we could kind of do everything or do anything. And very courageous people. But I'll rest with that and move on to the next person.
Yeah, so Larry, talk about what brought you to Santa Cruz and how you got connected to LAGMU.
Sure. I moved from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I grew up in Michigan. I moved to Santa Cruz in 1971 in the fall. I still was considering myself to be straight at that time. I really had never had an experience with a man, and came to work as a social worker in Santa Cruz. In 1974, I became part of a men's support group that kind of paralleled the feminist movement, women's support groups. And my housemate was a guy named Mark Henry, and he was part of that group, and Anthony Eschbach and Scott Soares were part of that group. And Dan, I believe you became part of that group, and a lot of the men in that group started coming out or were already gay and out. And I finally came to terms with my own sexuality. This was in the summer, I think, of 74. Had my first sexual experience with a man who is on this call today, and did somehow with Dan, got involved with this group of people and with LAGMU, and was part of the founding of it. I remember Ida Murray, who was like the college health officer or something like that. And we started meeting at LAGMU at the college, and I got involved doing the newsletter. And the rest is history. That's it.
Great.
I mean, Billy Paul.
Arthur?
Billy Paul was the other Cabrillo person.
Oh,
Yes,
Oh,
right.
That's
Billy
right.
Paul.
We did a lot of scheduling.
So Arthur, what brought you to Santa Cruz and how did you get connected to LAGMU?
I moved to Santa Cruz from Palo Alto with my boyfriend, Bill Mitchell. And Bill, I think, was the one who got in touch with either Judith or Shawn. And 3 people came to where we were living in Capitola. And then we got involved with the group. And we already had experience with the Stanford Gay People's Union that I helped start with about 5 other people. And that group has grown and is still under a different name. And there's now about 8 or 10 groups at Stanford. And I stay in touch with them.
Great. Dan, how about you, Dan?
Oh,
What
why-
brought you to Santa Cruz and how did you get connected to LAGMU?
I just wanted to ask if we have anything to interject when somebody's talking. Can we do that? I mean,
I don't know that. Go ahead. You've got a little time right now.
Well, I meant when Arthur was talking, I just wanted to ask a quick question, but or say something.
You've got a minute now if you want to say something.
Well, I'm just going to talk about myself. I just want to know if that's okay. If that's okay. I held this up before. This is David and I right at the 70s, if you can see that. Look a little different then. And I was kind of politically active in college, but got more so when I joined VISTA Volunteers in Service to America and became a community organizer. So I had a background of wanting to do things. And then when I got married in 1970 to a woman that was also in the VISTA. And so I was living in Tucson, and then we migrated around and ended up in Santa Cruz. And I had been in a men's group in Berkeley and also found one in Santa Cruz that was not a gay men's group. And I was coming out at that time in my mind. And so one thing led to another, and I found a man that I liked. And after that, I ended up divorcing my wife after some problems, and then then there was another men's group going, and so I was in that, and I can't figure out how I met Shawn. I know I'm meeting him in his Capitola house, and I also, as Joe Eugene mentioned, there was someone from UCSC named Wally who was founding a gay group. I remember going to his house now, and so I was making those connections, and somehow things came together, and you know, that's what I want Shawn and Judith is how did, because I know that Shawn was at the meeting at our house along with Judith. We were planning something, and then we just somehow decided to have a meeting, and I don't know for sure how we ever got people to come to that meeting of LAGMU the first time. I don't even remember a poster. We had a very skillful artist named Brian Williams who did posters later, but somehow word got out. I can't remember who was there or what it was like, but I thought it when I came out, I just wanted to be personally developing, and then I realized how political it was. I hadn't even heard of Stonewall, so it dawned on me that this was, you know, along with my socialist feminist ideas, I realized that I wanted to be involved politically, and this was the way to do it.
Can I add something? Just Dan mentioned how it got involved, and David mentioned about houses. But I think a lot in the beginning, we all lived in different houses with roommates that were also involved in things. That I think those houses was played such a critical way of communicating and getting people involved that were already involved in other things. And after that, it just kind of spread like a weed.
Yeah, Santa Cruz was very political. Yeah.
It was mostly word of mouth, I think. When we had meetings and stuff at the very beginning, we met over at the junior college. I do remember that, having meetings there.
Yeah, we met in the big room in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And perhaps Mona's Gorilla Lounge had something to do with spreading the word.
Yeah, Mona's was.
That's right. I was a bouncer there for a while. Yeah. And
So-
I had a real interesting one time I want to tell you real quick at Mona's Gorilla Lounge. This is okay. This is PG. That I had these 3 young men come in and they were trying to give me a bad time because I was a big old fat girl. And all I did was raise my hands like this, and every gay man in that place came and stood right behind me. And those 3 punks left.
I remember
That was the kind of thing we had.
So,
That was what was beautiful.
so that's great. So Shawn and Jude, can you talk a little bit about how you decided to get this thing started? Because I think, Shawn, you talked at one point about that you and Jude somehow met and then went and filed the paperwork. Can you talk a little bit about that first conversation?
I remember vaguely, Jude, you and I, we talked about it, and we went to fill some paperwork out with Billy Paul.
Yes, at the
Dark hair,
college.
glasses, short woman. And she
Yes.
helped us kind of just
Helped us
get the
a lot.
room and figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
I wasn't
Yeah.
really a student.
No, I was, and I worked.
You
I
were.
worked at the college in that out of the health department. I was a nursing student. I began as a nursing student at Cabrillo. That was my thought. That was my focus, and everything changed.
And, you know,
As life does.
I don't think we were like, in a sense, visionaries in that we like had this big plan. I think it was
No.
more like, I think we wanted to do something, it wasn't happening, so we were just going to make it happen. And I think that's
And we
how a lot of
both
things
had
came about.
we both had a commitment that we knew we were not that weird, that there's a lot of people out there like us. I remember that conversation.
Yeah.
How did that conversation go?
Well, very supportive. I throughout my I guess adolescence and stuff, I always had a lot of guy friends. I had a hard time with women. I was a little rough around the edges, if you know what I mean. And so sometimes females had a hard time with me, but I don't know. I guess they used to call me a hag of some kind, and I've always been proud of that moniker. So
You asked something, how did that go? It made me think of, I was thinking about this earlier today. Everybody that got involved in that group, I mean, there was not always like peak, you know, really cool people. There were sometimes conflicts with women. There's sometimes conflicts, and maybe some people were too more radical than others. But
yeah,
people always seem to get along. And I think there's a lot of acceptance of one another, even though we had, you know, difficult times. But there's a lot of acceptance just to be who you were.
Great. So
If
that,
you
so
knew
that
who
was,
you were.
so it was, and it was the 2 of you that really filed the paperwork, correct?
yeah. Well,
I
I was
believe so.
working
I think
at the
so, yeah.
college, so it was simple for me to do that. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, and then Billy Paul helped us. I don't remember all parts of it. I wished I did, but I don't. I do know that it seems like we were at the right place at the right time doing what we were supposed to be doing, and we've just continued it on. That's the
Well,
only way I can explain
And
it.
the other thing I remember, there was a sit-in in the president's office, which I sat in. I don't even remember what it was for now. There's a bunch of students, and in that sit-in, there were some gay men in that thing. So I think it's, like I said, I think it just snowballed.
Yeah. Well,
So-
it was a political time for the college too. I mean, and Ida May went out on a limb. Ida Murray, that's right.
Yeah.
Went out on a limb to give us the umbrella of a place to meet. It gave us, it put us mainstream actually with what it did on some levels. It began.
And I don't know about others, but I'm sure between David and I, there was an intention to not have the organization be leaderless.
Right.
And we didn't even have committees that I recall. People just did things, but we never had a president or anything like that. And sometimes that was a problem, but
Yeah.
it was part of the, like that's really important. These other houses, there were socialist houses. There was, you know, it was a very radical time in Santa Cruz. So it was very good that we had that support from other groups and there were a lot of some houses were just women. And
How many of you, do any of you remember the first meeting and what that was like?
I don't.
I don't remember really the first meeting.
Nope, not a clue.
Not
I
a clue.
remember the feel of a lot of the early meetings.
were
Shawn,
there?
you want to
Like-
talk about that, Shawn?
Or,
Yeah, for me, when I remember the early meetings, I just remember a lot of, there was discussion often about, lesbian men, gay men and stuff. That seemed to be an ongoing issue. But it seemed like the focus was really people just wanted to be there and do something, see something happen, whether it be social or the Speakers Bureau came out of there. We obviously organized the Gay Pride, but I think in the beginning, people just really wanted a place where they could be and be comfortable, other than a bar.
Yeah.
Great.
And we did something like if we planned the roller skating, that was amazing too.
Right.
Here's a gay people going to roller skating for the first time, together. And so things like that, we'd put a poster up, and pretty soon the social aspect was really important. And I think that drew in other people to come to the meetings. They saw there was an actual group, and we had potlucks every month, and there was always something like that in the planning stages.
Yeah, the potlucks were fabulous too. They were extremely well attended, filling up that whole big multi-use room at Cabrillo.
So LAGMU was a first, and Dan, you just mentioned roller skating was a first. What were some of the other, at the time, I don't know that you knew they were the first, but what were some of the other firsts because of LAGMU?
I remember a dance we had in the gymnasium that was great. I can't remember, maybe that was Sweet Chariot, but it was a really nice mix of men and women, I thought. We had a couple dances there.
At one point, we all met up at a church up close to the university. I don't remember what the denomination of the church was, but it was for family and friends of gay people. And my mother came to this thing, and she stood up and said she didn't understand the things that I was talking about and going through, but she loved me and was not going to lose me as her daughter. That was transformational for me.
Wow.
In my lifetime. She gave me acceptance, and here I was just a kid.
I think there are a lot of moments like that. Judith, I'll never forget the time you and I went to my old high school. Remember North Williams High School? It was great. I mean, it was very emotional for me. I didn't realize how emotional it was going to be. And it was great, though. And there were people in the classroom that, one guy was always talking, and Judith was great. He was kind of showing us how gay people talk. I think Judith just said, well, you do that really well. We had some great times as speakers here.
So, Dave Kirk, can you hear me?
Doggone.
So I see Dave Kirk joined us, and he was around at the beginning, but I don't hear his voice. So we'll, Dave, if you can hear me and you want to call in, then we'd love to hear your voice. Anyway, so for those of you who were there at the beginning, how many people were there? What were some of the interests of the people? What were some of the reasons people joined, and those kinds of questions? So what were some of those early meetings like for all of you? Some of those questions. And anybody could join in on any of those. Arthur, you want to start that one?
Bill and I arrived with about 2 years experience as activists. I had been involved with the Human Relations Commissions in Santa Clara County and statewide. We both worked on non-discrimination ordinances. We worked with the campus. I put together the second Stanford program on homosexuality in '74 with Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin. And let's see, Dr. Evelyn Hooker. And two early gay therapists, men, and packed the place. We also did dances almost every week, and 200-300 people would show up on campus, and most weren't students because there was nothing else to do besides the bars. So we brought that experience with us.
When you say that at the campus, which campus was that?
Stanford.
Oh, at Stanford. Okay. So, and then when you came to Santa Cruz, you brought that experience, and then what were some of those early meetings like in Santa Cruz?
It was very similar in that we were still figuring out who we were, and there was basic discussions about what language we used to describe ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
We're still making lists about what occupations gay people had. It was like a big discovery. And we were all young. I mean, and most of us have been traumatized. So we were still figuring out our emotional language, our relationships, who we were in the world. I had severe difficulties with anger, and it took me a good 8 to 10 years to learn to manage that. Plus, we were in the middle of the 70s when the lid came off of 1950 smug America.
Right.
At the tail end of the Vietnam War, and the whole society was in upheaval, and we were part of that.
It's important to remember that, you know, there was like, I think of it as a sequence of events, like there's the beat movement, kind of developed into the hippie movement, and that was such a social upheaval for people. And I think we were just kind of at the end of the hippie movement, you know. Remember there's androgyny and gender bender and all sorts of things going on that people were really trying to find themselves and try different things. So it was a times confusing time, but it was also a very exciting time because, like David mentioned, we felt like we could do anything. And we did. We organized all these different things.
Well, it was incredibly joyous that we had our own space, and
Yeah.
we're beginning to take control of our lives. It was not what a lot of people expected, but it never is. And we were very lucky that Cabrillo was supportive.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Paul often went the extra mile for us.
To me, it felt
This
like
is Larry. Listen,
to me, it felt like an incredibly safe place. I just remember this kind of feeling of it being like an oasis. And it's interesting how it was mid-county and it was kind of a working class, mixed class setting. It wasn't in, you know, downtown Santa Cruz, and UCSD was kind of remote and elitist. And so it drew people from all walks of life, really, not just students. And it was in some ways a cruising ground or a way to meet boyfriends or girlfriends. You know, I met a really important, you know, boyfriend in my life, Thomas. And I think probably other people, you know, met boyfriends and girlfriends, and just the social aspect was so important.
Larry, you want to
I
add
thought
into
it was,
this?
yeah. I was
Robert,
going to say that. I was going to say that for me, a big part of it was that it was an alternative to the bar, and you know, Mona's was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, but to actually be in a space where you could have conversations with other men and talk to women and plan events, which were like somebody said the roller skating, the dances, the potlucks, was all great. And of course, the big culmination of the first year was the first Gay Pride, that whole huge weekend. Are we going to talk about that later at another time or
Different
sometime
time.
later
We'll
on this
talk.
call?
Yeah, we're just talking about the beginning of LAGMU.
Sure.
But
Sure.
what I'd love
Sure.
to hear now is what were your meetings like? I mean, you all walked into a room. How did they start? How did you decide what was going to be discussed and that sort of thing?
I think Judith went, woo-hoo.
Yeah.
That called the meeting to order. From
Can
there
you
on,
do
it
that?
was
Do that
chaos.
again, Dan.
Woo-hoo!
That's it.
And then what would happen after that?
We'd start laughing at me.
People would bring up different stuff. You know, we talked about things we wanted to organize, ideas, and I think another people just brought other issues they wanted to talk about. And there was a lot of discussion about titles and names and gay men versus lesbian. You know, that was always an underlying struggle, but not a bad one. I mean, I think we all worked together, and some people split off. A lot of other groups developed out of that group.
And
I remember when we had the newsletter that when Larry Friedman was telling people about it, he said, you give us your name and your address and it'll come in a plain envelope with nothing on it. Nobody will know who it's from.
so Larry, you want to talk about the beginning of the newsletter and how that happened?
Well, that was Larry.
I really honestly don't remember, except that I think I was willing to do it. And I saw that you showed the image of the first LAGMU newsletter from April of '75. and it had my name on it. I obviously didn't do it all alone, but I don't really remember.
Do any of the rest of you remember receiving the newsletter at your house in a brown covered container?
I think we put them out from our house on Butter Street all the time. Yeah.
Shawn, say that again.
You're right. You're right.
What we put them out from Butter Street.
Yeah, we had a Xerox. We had a mimeograph machine.
Well, you mentioned Wally, Dan. He started a group, I think, in 73 or 74 at UC, not 74, but at UCSC, I think. Yeah. We knew the Butter Street one.
Wally.
Talk about Sutter Street. What was that, Dan?
Putter Drive was where Dan and Shawn and I lived in Monterey Bay Heights in SoCal. And
you had a Xerox machine there?
No, a mimeograph.
It was like a mimeograph or something. But I remember that we had a huge mailing list, and it was amazing how well communicated we were in terms of just the mailing that went out. You know, we reached a lot of people.
Yeah.
And if I had to say one thing that this group did, it built so many strong bonds within the community as it grew, because when I think what went on later, the Prop 6 Briggs Initiative, Anita Bryant, I mean, there was already by that time a really good community and foundation of gay men and lesbian that you could work together. And now, you know, that was important.
How often were your meetings?
Really once a month, I think? Or?
I would think once a month.
Yeah, I think if we had the newsletters, we could have figured those questions out, because they announced future meetings and that.
Yeah, so sometime when the pandemic's over and you're all here, we can get all those out and look at them together. Because I know the MA has them all. Yeah.
And David and I started doing men's groups. I think, David, correct me, but during that time, we started doing the kind of men's groups we'd come from that weren't necessarily gay, but we pulled in some men from that too. We did it at the Veterans Building, as I recall. Downtown. And so, you know, we'd probably put an ad in the Sundays or something. And
yeah, these are drop-in groups every Thursday, I believe. And some of them were thematic. We had different themes like, you know, dads and sons and work. And we had really great attendance. You know, a lot of men came to those.
How many people would you say?
Oh, I'd say up to, you know, 12 to 20.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were later men's groups. I know Patrick Meyer kind of branched off and did men's groups at Loudon Nelson for a long time that were like really well attended.
Remember when we also did they came down from San Francisco. I can't remember the two guys' names, and we did like
Cruising 101.
Yeah, Cruising 101, and that had a lot of men there.
And how many people would be at your LAGMU meetings?
Oh, it could be anywhere from 15 to 50.
Oh, wow!
It got pretty big. There's quite a few people.
Especially when we were getting together, putting our ideas about doing the It's About Time, the video movie, and the Gay Pride Week. I think we were the very first county in the United States that the county commissioners declared a Gay Pride Week. I'm sure we were the first ones in the United States to have that happen.
And to hear more about that, you'll have to tune into another webinar. No, that's okay, because all these things grew from the LAGMU group, and that's the fascinating part. So Dan, you mentioned a publication called Sundays. Is that what you said?
Oh, that was a alternative newspaper that morphed about 10 or 12 times into the Metro in Santa Cruz. Right. I believe the first one was Sundays. That was when I arrived, I think.
Was there a Good Times or something? Was there another newspaper?
Was the Good Times around then?
Oh yeah. They were. One was entertainment, and the other was more community news and stuff.
So would you all advertise in those somehow?
Oh yeah.
How would you do that? Talk about that, Dan.
We just put notices in their calendars, and you know, I don't know. There wasn't any real political thing until Pride started, we didn't like speak out about all the other horrible things going on against the gay community that we were aware of them. And some people would bring that to the LAGMU meetings. They'd heard about some horrible thing happening in some other part of the country, but we didn't really, I don't even know if we ever had letter writing campaigns or anything. So we were aware of this stuff and we were educating ourselves. And then Anita Bryant came along, and that was the straw that got us involved, I think. I remember quite a few LAGMU meetings devoted to Anita Bryant, don't you, Arthur, or something?
Vaguely. Was Mona's near the Rio Theater?
No, that was the
That was
Dragon
Dragon
Moon.
Moon.
Okay, Dragon Moon was a problem with soldiers coming from the fort.
Yeah, Fort Ord.
Yeah.
Trying to pick up lesbians. And the woman who owned it asked for volunteers because she couldn't afford to put 4 people on the door. And I was one of the 4 or 5 people who would be on the door. The soldiers would show up, and we would refuse them entry, and some of them would get threatening. And there was one guy who would show up with his wife, who had a criminal history. She wasn't much better. She would try to pick up women to take home for a three-way with her husband. He was violent, and one night he called the police, and the man fought with the officer in the bar, and I was able to push both of them out into the alley, and it took the officer and I a good 3 minutes to get him into handcuffs. And then I went to court and testified that he was a danger and he had struck the officer, and he ended up going to jail.
Wow.
There were some dangers in going to the bar.
I've not heard that story.
So you've all brought up the names of the different bars, but let's just get that on the record here. So you talked about Dragon Moon, and what were the other bars that gay people?
Mona's Gorilla Lounge.
The first one that I was aware of.
And that's
That
the
was
one by
before
Dominican Hospital?
Yeah, that's one that's Moe's
Yeah.
Alley. The new business there is Moe's Alley.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's before the Dragon Moon. It was definitely the only game in town was Mona's.
Yeah,
Right.
there was a
When
couple of
Dragon
bars
Moon-
by the
When Dragon Moon
Before
opened,
that.
it was exciting because you could go bar hopping. You could go to one and you could go to the other, and sometimes back and forth several times during the night.
And then there was one down by the boardwalk that was
Right.
kind of long. Then there was one in
Right.
Harvey West Park.
Shelley's too.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
And I think
But
one.
these are later.
Oh yeah.
The other
So
thing,
then at some point you'd have maybe 4 bars to bar hop to.
the other thing that drops out of the history is at that time, Santa Cruz was a very divided community. Watsonville was run by farm families, and they were very conservative. Around the university, you had a lot of liberals. And then sort of in the middle, you had retirees and a lot of wealthy people. And a lot of them came just for the summer. So it was, and they didn't always get along. And the retirees in particular were not happy with all of us coming out and being visible. I remember Judith, what's her name? The other Judith, no, not Judith. What was her name? Hilda Lands.
Oh yeah.
Oh, God,
Hilda Lands coming to the Board of Supervisors for the county complaining about gay people because we got an early non-discrimination ordinance through the Board of Supervisors. And she was really upset about that. And her logic was seriously flawed. And the supervisors would just sort of roll their eyes while she was speaking. Yeah, she was quite a case.
It's interesting. Yeah, we're always detractors, right? And that's true of every community, and Santa Cruz certainly had them. Is there anything else specifically about the beginning of LAGMU or the LAGMU meetings that any of you want to share before we kind of reflect back on what this time was about? Any other memories or things you did?
One memory I have, just because Arthur spurred it, that when we first started the Speakers Bureau, I remember going down to Fort Ord and I can't remember how we got invited or who came, but that was really scary going on to the base. I think we somehow had it seemed like it was a priest or somebody there who was the contact person.
And Shawn, you talked about the Speakers Bureau also. What would you, when you would go to a school or to an organization, what would you all talk about?
It was great because the teachers gave us a lot of leeway. I remember going to Watsonville High School, and that's where we met 2 or 3, Tommy and some other, and Brian, and people that got involved that were in high school. And so that kind of brought that part of the county together. But we would usually talk about the myths, gay myths. We would let them ask questions. I was always trying to pull out of them what they thought about gay people, and how that's part of a myth. I mean, that was a lot of it. And we had one at Harbor High School. We had a whole week where we had like a lesbian mom with her gay son, and each during that week they talked about different subjects, families and stuff. It was great.
Dan, do you have any other memories of the Speakers Bureau that you did?
Not really.
Okay, that's all right.
I have one of the good memories if I can. We went there was a woman, Barbara, I forget her last name. She's a teacher, long dark hair. She taught at Hartnell College, a night class. And I forget who went, but we went there one night. We had about 3 hours. About an hour and a half into it, I remember nothing was happening. We couldn't get them to budge. They were just stuck. So Barbara and I switched clothes. I put on her skirt, and whatever she had. But you know what? It broke the ice. It was great. It was fun to do things like that.
I just thought of something that, and it does have to do with this topic. What about our jobs? And early, Santa Cruz didn't have any ordinances. I think I was a bus driver at that time, and it was a time it was growing, and there became lots of gay and lesbian people, but I never was out on my job, if that was it. And Shawn was in childcare, Larry was working in a restaurant, I don't know, but did anybody else ever feel you could share stuff that you were doing in the community?
In your jobs?
With our job mates?
Yeah, why don't you talk about the jobs you had at the time and your response to that question?
Do you remember
So I'll
John Ingalls?
Go ahead, Larry. Why don't you start?
Sure. I worked at the Solarium restaurant, which is a very critical restaurant in those days. I was the last woman I dated in 1974 lived next door to Joseph Schultz, who then began this restaurant bringing food to the Solarium on weekends, and he called his little thing India Joe's, and I started chopping onions and working for him, and then I started serving food. This is in 74, and then I lived only like 3 blocks away or 6 blocks away from there on Stanford Avenue, and the Solarium was a hub for gay people. It was owned by 2 gay men. I don't know if people remember that, Donald and Eduardo. And they planted the garden. It's where the crepe place is currently in Santa Cruz. It was originally a gay-owned deli, and on weekends, Joseph brought in food, and I worked there, and I was meeting all these gay people, and I then was in my men's group coming out. Then LAGMU started, and the Solarium closed maybe in 75, but there were people from the Solarium who got to hear about the beginning of LAGMU, and that was my job, and it was only a couple days a week, and I was working odd jobs here and there. So that was my work. There you go. And then
Jude,
I went to work for the county.
Jude, what was your work at the time?
I was working as a nurse's aide at a convalescent hospital. Actually, I started out at Santa Cruz County General at the regular one, and then I went into geriatrics. It was a little easier. I was more drawn to that rather than critical care.
Mm-hmm.
And I never had a problem. But I wasn't out as a lesbian either, though. So,
Shawn, you were going to talk a little bit about your work?
Well, I was always amazed how many gay men and lesbians were in the county. Just fine, because I worked at John Ingalls Frozen Foods, like the night shift.
Oh, right.
And there was a lot of gay men. One of the supervisors was gay. There's a lot of lesbians there. and it was a shit job. But because of all the people that worked there, I really enjoyed going there, even though I missed out on Friday and Saturday nights because I had to work. But it was a great job as long as it lasted.
Arthur, what was your work in Santa Cruz?
I had transferred from Denny's in Los Altos, where I was the first man hired on the West Coast to work breakfast shift, to one in Santa Cruz, which was insane, particularly during the tourist season. And I went from a really good manager to a horrible manager. And one day when we were just slammed with tourists and the manager was refusing to lift a finger to help us, I just suggested to all of the people we were working with, there was like 8 of us on the shift, that we all walk out, and we did. And 2 of them got rehired. The rest of us didn't. But we left the manager with a full restaurant and no employees.
David, what kind of work were you in?
Well, I was at UCSC. I was still a student. I graduated in June of '75, and I was working in the library at UCSC, and that was a very safe environment. I'm sure I could have been out if I was just coming out, so I wasn't very verbal with mainstream people at that point. And so I was still a student, and I was kind of pretending to go to classes, even though my energy was going into LAGMU and other community groups. So I was trying to finish up, which I did. But I was pretty much just absorbed in coming out and being in community groups and having friends and, being 21. And I didn't feel inhibited at all, really, because I was in a fairly safe situation.
Did you work with other lesbians and gay men?
In the library at UCSC, there were other gay men and lesbians.
I was thinking of the Children's Center.
I wasn't in the Children's Center yet, not until later, later on in 77. And definitely there was one of my fellow teachers was a lesbian, and we even talked about having a child together. And enough children in my life now.
So let's talk a little bit about the time and place. So in the 70s, what caused you to all come together and do what you did? So David, what if you start with that, kind of your thoughts on that, and then we'll kind of go through anybody else who wants to join in on that question.
I think being an activist and being politically minded and really being interested in feminist politics, and I was a politics major at UCSC, and it was the times. I was involved in the anti-war movement and went to anti-war protests and was a draft counselor and received draft counseling and was a conscientious objector. And I think they call it intersectionality now, but we didn't have such fancy words back then. And we just saw, kind of common threads and common causes for the different kinds of, repression and oppression that different groups had. And so I really like kind of the personal politics of the era and that. And my coming out was really intertwined with all that. And, Santa Cruz and the Bay Area, seemed to be a perfect place for that because there were so many like-minded people. I did have one thought that's fairly related to all this, but one really special feature of LAGMU was that it drew a wide range of ages. I remember Brian Williams, who I think was only like 16, 17 years old at the time. And he came to meetings. He was still a junior or senior at Aptos High. And, there were, Gene Harding, who was in his 50s or 60s at the time. And so it was a pretty wide span, and it was so ideal that it was taking place at a community college that drew people from, all over the place. And so I think that made it especially a great group.
Who else would like to talk about why that time and place was so important?
Well, I'll say one thing. I didn't have any friends. I mean, I had a couple of friends when I moved down to Santa Cruz. there were 2 people living there. That's why I moved there. But other than that, this was the way to make friends of any kind, was to come out.
Mm.
And also, I think we didn't mention that LAGMU spawned the help me people. I
Over
want to
40.
say over 70s group, but
No, over 40.
it was
Over
the over
40s
40s was
Because
senior
40 was
citizens.
old. Yeah.
And we'd see these men at the bar, and we'd see these men in their bar, and I never approached them because they were so old. They were probably in their 40s. so that was a really great group, though. Lou Harrison was involved in it,
And Eugene Harding.
and Eugene Harding and his
Yeah,
partner.
yeah.
So that was a really amazing diversity.
You want to
I
add
think
into
it's
that, Larry?
interesting we didn't talk about intergenerational things, but it was how
Yeah,
going on.
I actually, I ended up living at Eugene Harding's house, and he hosted a lot of those potlucks, and his friend, partner, companion, Ray Mortz, who was quite the old hippie guy with quite a story himself. But the over 40s started, and then it became the over and under 40s, and then it became the over 60s. Now it is the over 60s group through the Diversity Center. But I was part of that because I lived at Gene's house for a while.
And Shawn, did you want to say something about intergenerational?
I was just thinking about it when Dan was talking, that before I really thought about intergenerational stuff, it was already happening with LAGMU, and I thought that was cool, you know, because I don't think we were really conscious talking about it then. We were just aware of it, but,
Right.
you know.
Arthur, anything else to add to that?
Several of my mentors were older, well-connected. So I was fortunate in that. And it was sort of at the periphery. I was just happy to have a place where there were people who shared my experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot more attractive than being at either bar.
Mm.
The bars were pretty depressing. I mean, they were bare bones.
And Judith, any thoughts on that from you?
I think it was a pretty transformational time for all of us. And that was why we banded together. I think we realized then that we were all in the same tribe, if you will. And I still have people in my tribe that I've known for more than 50 years. I think that's what we're supposed to do. When we feel that likeness and that familiarity, there's a reason for that. Yeah, it was a very important time for me.
So as we were, just the final question, and then I'll take some questions from the chat room. As you all look back from the beginning of LAGMU, what did you gain or learn from that experience that you want to share with other people today? So reflect back, and what did it mean to you, and what did it mean at the time for the overall LGBTQ rights movement, or any aspect of that? So Jude, I think I'll start with you.
Well, I'll just briefly say, I think that thinking back on that group, we all accepted one another, absolutely, without, and it was a political way to do it. I mean, we were openly saying that these are people that I spend time with. I think I don't know. I think we've carried it on continually. I don't know. You go ahead, Dan. Are you
I think
something to say?
Was that Shawn? Go ahead, Shawn.
I'm just gonna say, for that time, the slogan, "The personal is political and political is personal," that was so true of that time, because our personal struggles were really political ones, and vice versa. And I think that was a really important thing. And David said something else, I think I'll say it again, that I think we did feel like we could do just about anything. We did a lot of stuff. Put on gay pride, we did videos. I mean, we did a lot of things, you know, and that was really empowering.
Mm-hmm.
Larry, how about you?
Yeah, I wanted to say I found community, because before that, I was struggling in Santa Cruz. I had moved here in '71, so I was 3 years into living here, and I had acquaintances and I had worked in different settings, but it was really the beginning of LAGMU and that first year that cemented my relationship with so many people, and also with becoming an activist, which I had never done before. So it was amazing time for me. My self-confidence tremendously grew.
Great. Dan?
That's it.
Oh, I think it's just kind of set the direction of my life. One thing was, because I had a hard time figuring out what I wanted to do in life for the job. And when I went to work for the bus company, I was probably what nobody else was out. It was owned privately. It was about 12 employees. But when it grew, it was so great because as more and more gay and lesbian people came, I realized there was a place I could work and feel really comfortable. And that's around straight people too, because they were so supportive. So kind of got my job life together.
Cool. Arthur?
What was the question again?
Just kind of as you reflect back, what did you gain or learn from the experience that you want to share with people today?
I was able to have family, and I was able to have close friends, which I hadn't had as a teenager. I was able to start grappling with all of the traumas I experienced in a safe environment, supportive environment. I became a better person. It's an ongoing process, and it was a safe space. And people were kind and often loving, and it was a lot of fun, and the energy in the room was often just electric. We were all just so excited to find each other.
And David?
I think the only thing I can add is that I was very young. I was 21 and still in university, and it was a nice bridge into the community for me in terms of, making friends away from UC Santa Cruz. And, I met some lifelong friends like Larry and Shawn, and of course Dan, and other really important people in my life. So it kind of anchored me in a very supportive community. And then it was kind of the basis from which so many other groups were spawned, and I think that's all I can say is this was a very important part for me and of my becoming an adult.
Great. So Dave Kirk, I know you put something in the chat, so hopefully we'll get to hear your voice in a future conversation here. Sorry, it didn't work for today. So there's a couple questions in here. Somebody asked, did you raise money for LAGMU, and how did you do that?
Didn't we have dues? I don't remember.
I think we just asked for donations, and we ran everything on like a shoestring. I mean, I think it was all by donations.
I think we collected some monies at the dance.
Remember, the dance was $2. It cost $2 to get into the dance.
And then did you consider yourselves a political organization at the time?
As I recall, we wanted to steer clear of that because some people might have been scared off by it. I know that sometimes discussions came up and we talking about socialist feminism, and I think some people were, as with our candidate for president, misinterpreting what the word socialist meant. But I think that we really kind of walked a tightrope at times. I think we definitely leaned more towards the political, but we're aware that people might just be looking for a social activity.
Shawn, what about you? What do you remember? Oh, Shawn, are you gone?
Yeah, no, I said, I'm glad you can't see me because it's just a little emotional for me.
Oh,
it's okay.
So that's, yeah,
no,
that's, go ahead.
I don't know if I have anything more to say. I mean, I think people have covered everything, how important it was. And it was a time when people lived together, they worked together, and it was just a really tight community. And it developed that way.
Yeah, we traded boyfriends.
And then somebody asked, have you all had any kind of reunion since that time?
Absolutely.
Of sorts, because at the 25th anniversary in 2000, we have a picture of a bunch of us. We were honored to be Grand Marshals. And then in 2000, the good people at Diversity Center had the Pride Be a Pioneer event.
2014.
Right, Trailblazers.
But yeah,
Trailblazers.
So
2014.
we've gotten together, and of course, there's so many people still around in Santa Cruz from that era. But this is
I
great.
think that's the last time I saw Shawn was at the Trailblazers
Yeah,
gathering.
I
And that
haven't
was,
been there since. I haven't been.
yeah,
I'm due for a trip.
2014. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
sorry.
Well, hopefully we'll make that reunion happen once the pandemic is over.
By
And,
the way, the kids in the frames behind me are my 2 granddaughters.
We can't quite see him, Dan. So
Oh dear.
move the computer. Move the computer.
that-
a little bit. There
we'll
we
have
are.
to do that for the after party too. We
And
can.
it's son, and our son and daughter-in-law too.
So I'm going to close this part out, but anybody who wants to hang around and share photos and things like that, then you're welcome to do so. I'll stop the recording in just a second, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. Again, if you'd fill out the feedback form on my website, www.robdarrow.us. We're hopeful that you will share your stories with different aspects of this and think about other stories that can be part of future webinars like this. Our next webinar will be next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. I'm not sure of the topic yet because I'm still talking to those people. And then next Thursday, we'll be back here as well. So just know there's an ongoing group that will be meeting, and we look forward to seeing all of you then.
And if any